Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today I can't believe it's October already. Actually, it's quite scary how quickly time is going. I was thinking about this earlier today, and actually it's still very warm outside. So trying to decide what coat to wear in the morning to the train station is certainly a difficult one. But anyway, thank you very much for everyone joining us today. Please do write any questions that you might have in the chat box. I think Pip has just dropped a note in there as well. But please do type any questions in there. But we'd obviously love to hear where you're joining us today, whether that be local in London, to where we are, or further afield. Would be brilliant. So please do say hello to everyone. Hello, Keely. Thank you for joining us. And we will wait a couple of minutes whilst everyone is joining. Hello, Raf. Oh, hello, Samantha. Gosh, wow, we've got quite a few people saying hello as well. Now, very excited because we have Laura joining us today, and this is the first webinar that C&C have held with Laura. So a very warm welcome to you. And we've still got lots of people saying hello as well. So gosh, we have someone from Italy, Egypt, Leicester,
wow,
Bristol, so very far afield. But very warm welcome to you, Laura. How are you?
Yeah, really well. Thank you so much, Elspeth. Really delighted to be here with you today. And yeah, so happy that we've got some global attendees. That's very exciting.
Definitely, definitely. And obviously, it's a really interesting conversation that we'll be having today in a presentation you'll be doing around crucial conversations and obviously how to deal with feedback as well. I guess a bit of an introduction about who I am. For those who don't know me, my name is Elspeth and I work at C&C Search. I focus on the HR perspective. I'm sort of focusing on HR recruitment, and I actually decided to do my CIPD level 5, oh gosh, about 2 years or so ago now. So very passionate about the HR field, and I love connecting with different people. And as I said, we are joined by Laura today as well. So Laura is an executive coach who helps master clients with a mindset to evaluate the work performance and relationships and fulfillment. And you were actually in the legal sector prior to sort of starting your own consultancy business, which is very exciting.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Happy to, are you happy for me to kick off?
Absolutely. Please do start, Laura. Over to you.
Brilliant, lovely. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. Really, really appreciate it. And hi, everyone. Obviously, I can't see your faces, but it's wonderful to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about something which is really, really close to my heart, crucial conversations in the context of feedback. So first of all, to add on to what Elspeth has said, a little bit about me. So I am the founder of a coaching and inclusive leadership development consultancy called Altura Coaching. Before that, I worked in HR for about 12 years, and that was mainly in recruitment and learning and development, diversity, equity and inclusion and well-being. And that sort of spanned a variety of sectors, fast-moving consumer goods, finance, and as Elspeth alluded to, more recently in law, where I was the recruitment and learning manager for the London office of a US law firm. So I suppose a little bit about why I do this work, because I think that's very, very important. I have always been really curious about what motivates people, what their pain points are, what their self-concept is, how that is shaped, and then crucially, how that affects relationships and workplace dynamics. I coached really throughout the second half of my HR career informally. And then I took advantage of a period of furlough at the start of the pandemic to qualify as an executive coach with the Academy of Executive Coaching. And now the work that I do really is about bringing together what I like to think of two sides of a circle. So I work on the one hand with organisations, mainly law firms, but also wider professional services organisations, to attract, retain, develop, progress talent and lower psychosocial risk. And then on the other hand, I work with individuals, as you said, Elspeth, to support people in mastering their mindset, to take advantage really or get to that point of sustained high performance, well-being and fulfillment. So I like to bring those two sides together to really try to work with organisations to become people first, inclusive workplaces. And I think we've seen throughout the pandemic and the point that we're at now, that there really has been a shift in the sorts of needs we have for our workplaces and the sorts of leaders that we want. And I should say also as well that diversity, equity and inclusion considerations are at the heart of my work. And even though we have to look at identity strands together, you know, we've got to have an intersectional lens. I do focus primarily on race and ethnicity. So today we're going to be talking about crucial conversations. So first of all, why have I chosen that term? A lot of the time we hear about difficult or sensitive conversations, but I prefer crucial conversations. The reason being that I think if we go into a conversation thinking already that it's going to be difficult or sensitive, we tend to do one of two things. The first is that we bury our head in the sand and we think, well, if this is a difficult conversation, why would I want to have it? And so we refuse to have it at all. Or we armor up and we bowl into the conversation without the necessary preparation. So there are clearly many different types of crucial conversation that can take place at work. One could be, for example, a mental health diagnosis disclosure to a line manager. It could be a pay negotiation, could be a request in working arrangements. But today we're going to talk about feedback. So we're really living in a feedback culture. If you think about the last time that you got an Uber, or the last time that you made a purchase online or booked a table at your favorite restaurant, it's entirely likely that within a few minutes of doing that, you received a survey to ask for feedback. So service providers are really, really aware that it's so crucial to seek feedback to understand how they can do better and gain competitive advantage. But this doesn't always translate to the workplace. And I think the reason for that is, especially if we look at what I like to call developmental feedback, we assume that we are going to hurt someone's feelings. Or maybe we think, well, actually, the last time I was given some developmental feedback, I didn't react particularly well. So why would someone in my shoes then enjoy listening to what I have to say? But feedback is absolutely crucial. I'm going to take you through really quickly the overview for what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll start off by looking at why feedback matters and why, if it's so important, we're quite so reluctant to give it. We will then look at tools which can help us as feedback givers. And accompanying those tools, so I'm going to share with you a model that I find particularly helpful, and also 5 key considerations for feedback conversations. And then we're going to look at the other side of the coin, and we're going to look at responding to feedback, because it is highly unlikely that we will be adept feedback givers if we don't know how to respond to feedback ourselves. And I call it a skill because it absolutely is a skill in its own right. Anyone on this workshop, and there's a few people that I know on here, which is brilliant, will know that I am passionate about talking about emotional literacy or emotional intelligence, EQ, in the workplace in general, and it's really, really important for feedback conversations. So we'll be looking at that. And then also relatedly, relationships as really the enabler of a successful feedback outcome. So relationships are really at the heart of my work, and that's something that I would like all of you to bear in mind as we move through today, that relationships are the soil, if you like, in which we're planting these feedback seeds. So this session is really aimed to be as interactive and participative as possible. Elspeth has very, very kindly agreed to monitor the chat function for me. I will be stopping at regular intervals to do some reflection work with you, to share discussion points, and there will be time for questions throughout. I will also aim to finish in time, so we're here together until 1:30 today, to have some questions at the end. But if I don't cover everything that you want to know, you will be receiving my contact details at the end. So please do get involved as and when it feels applicable. So let's dive in. And I'm actually going to start off by handing over to you. So Elspeth, your first chat monitoring, please. I would like all of you to cast your mind back to a time where you had a good feedback experience. Now, what I mean by that isn't a time that you received some good feedback. It can either be positive or developmental feedback. You'll see here that I don't refer to negative feedback. because why should we put a label such as negative on something which has the possibility to be so positive if done skillfully? And I want you to think about your feedback giver's approach and what it was that made it successful for you personally. So just spend, please, about 30 seconds thinking about that. And those of you who are comfortable sharing in the chat, please, we like to preserve anonymity here. So we're not going to name our feedback givers, but can you please say in the chat, and then Elspeth, if you'd be happy to read some of those out, what made the approach so successful?
Definitely, and actually we've already had someone come in straight away who says it was a positive discussion with examples and helpful insights on how to change going forward. The person then goes on to say they really wanted me to grow and be a better person, which I think is really key, you know, looking at that development aspect, as you've just mentioned as well, Laura.
Yeah, wonderful, fantastic. I can see there's a hand raised there. I don't know if that's something we can go to, Elspeth.
Yeah, definitely. And actually we just had someone else come in to say honest, real examples, i.e., you know, flannel, when sort of having that discussion and feedback. Someone else has said friendly, open and honest, gave achievable targets and a forward direction whilst recognizing what I am already doing well, which I think is really brilliant, is to highlight what someone is already achieving.
Yeah.
As well. Someone else has said it was personal to me and time was given to allow me to listen and reflect whilst asking others.
These are brilliant, and they really speak to quite a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm sure there's a lot more comments that sort of we could read off there, but just in the interest of time, what I'd now like everyone to do is to think about the opposite scenario now. So think about a time where someone didn't have a successful feedback approach. So again, this can be a conversation that was positive feedback or developmental feedback, and then think this time, what made it unsuccessful for you? What was it about their approach that made it unsuccessful? And again, just about another 30 seconds to reflect on that and put in the chat where you are comfortable doing so.
Right, so we've had someone who came in who said I had an experience that had a mixture of positive and constructive feedback, which is good. Someone else has put I felt attacked and demeaned. Someone else has said felt it did not have a good intent behind it. Someone else has said makes me feel incompetent, like the worst assistant in the world. So some really important factors. Someone else has just said abrupt, negative, unsupportive, keen to blurt it out and get it out of the way with no positive direction for future development, lack of trust. And interesting, someone has just said anything that seems like a personal attack, which I think is really important actually, using that personal word in there.
Yeah, I think that's an area where a lot of the time, if these conversations aren't managed skillfully, the feedback giver makes us feel as if they're talking about our identity, our essence, our person, right? It's an attack on our person rather than a piece of constructive feedback as to how we can improve a task or a skill, right? Yeah, and that really links back to the sort of growth mindset that absolutely our skills are moldable, developable, and the feedback should really speak to that, instead of being an attack on us. Okay, thank you so much everyone for sharing. Thanks, Elspeth, really appreciate that. So if we go back then to this question, and hopefully your answers and reflections there have helped surface this a little bit, as to why feedback matters. It's a critical component for leading and developing talent. And it's also really, really important for mental health, well-being and inclusion, which I'll come on to in a minute. So it's important because it's there all the time. We are constantly giving feedback. We are communicating on an hourly basis, at least, the extent to which we like, trust and respect other people. And that's through things such as the silences that we allow when someone's speaking. It's through the eye contact that we give or don't give other people, our tone of voice, our body language. And so if we don't think that we're constantly giving feedback, we're on slightly dangerous ground, because it almost certainly means that we are not as skilled communicators as we like to think we are. and that's something that I certainly remember realizing when I was a little bit more junior in my career. It's essential for performance development and motivation. So this is the thing, and I'm going to talk about this in a lot more detail. If we do this skillfully, we are prioritizing someone's long-term career advancement over our own feelings of discomfort and that fear that we have around hurting someone's feelings in the short term. So it really, really is, you know, that's the famous expression of feedback is a gift. It absolutely is if it's done right. And that's the point that we want to get to today. It's a way to keep learning. Put simply, if no one points out the mistakes that we're making, how are we ever going to change our behavior? And I mentioned a few seconds ago that it's really important for inclusion. Now, we know from research that minority ethnic employees are far less likely than their white counterparts to receive feedback at all, and especially high quality feedback. And why is this important? So it's important because if those employees aren't receiving feedback as to what they're doing wrong and what they're doing right, so they know specifically what behaviors to repeat in that instance, then it's less likely that they are going to be put forward for stretch assignments. And that means if they're not given stretch assignments, then they're less likely to be promoted. So we've looked at this a lot in the legal context, but it absolutely applies to all sectors. So we need to remember when we're giving feedback that our natural affinity bias, so that really refers to the fact that it's much more likely that we will feel comfortable giving feedback and engaging with people who share our same identity characteristics, such as race, gender, age, for example, means that we will more likely give feedback to people with whom we share those characteristics. But as leaders, we need to make sure that we're doing it for all of our team members. Okay, so if we know then that feedback is this important, why are we so reluctant to give it? So Kate Neville of Inclusive Leadership Strategy shares 4 main factors which are really overlapping. One is a desire to spare other people's feelings. Another is this preservation of the I'm nice, I'm a nice manager image, a wish to avoid discomfort. A lot of the time we can think that that's other people's discomfort, but we are really prioritizing our own neediness. And then there can be the very well known, well, actually, if I've got to give Jane some feedback that last time she didn't do this task very well, it's going to take me a long time. And, you know, we've got a deadline on this, so I'm just going to do the task myself. So we don't want to delegate. And there's actually a scientific reason as to why we avoid this discomfort. So some of you may have heard of Daniel Goleman. He's a psychologist who came up with the social and emotional intelligence model of the 1990s. And he really talks about something wonderful, which is the amygdala hijack. So if we are thinking that the conversation we're about to have with someone is going to be really uncomfortable and potentially there'll be conflict there, we want to avoid that. And what happens is our sympathetic nervous system triggers the well-known fight or flight response. And the amygdala, which is the feeling part of our brain, cuts off access to the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is associated with 9 sets of different, I suppose, behaviors, we could say, for want of a better word. But they are things like social cognition, decision-making, judgment, rationality. And this literally clouds our ability to think clearly. So what can happen is that we experience a physical reaction, which is akin to what we experience when we're about to go into a room of senior leaders and do a presentation. So our brain starts to literally cloud over and we shut down. And that's because our brain cannot distinguish between a real threat, such as a bear standing in front of us, and a perceived threat. So we're conserving energy to run in the face of this perceived conflict or discomfort. So if we add to that the fact that we are hardwired for belonging, for likability, agreement, and connection, is it really any wonder that we try and avoid this? So we need some tools. We really need some tools to counter our natural instincts. And Amy Gallo, who is the author of the Harvard Business Review Guide to Dealing with Conflict, says that preparation for these conversations is absolutely key. And there are a few things here that I want to highlight, which I'll also touch on a little bit later today. The first is that we need to shift the focus from us as the feedback giver to the other person as the receiver. And this is really about us thinking, okay, what's the purpose of this feedback? And what outcome do I want here? You know, am I giving this feedback because I'm a senior person, it's my job as a leader, I feel the obligation, or is it because we really, really want that other person's development and behavioural change? You know, does it speak to our own issues, our own ego, or does it speak to what they need? So secondly, we need to see things from another person's perspective. And I always love to highlight here how important it is to ask ourselves what the most generous interpretation of someone's behaviour is. So imagine, for example, that we've got someone in our team who has made the same mistakes now on a presentation 3 times in a row. Is it that they're really being negligent? Or is it that they don't really understand what's expected of them? Or actually, now we come to think of it, they have been looking really, really tired recently. Could there be something else going on for them? And then the last point, which I think is really, really interesting, and for all of those who would like to know more about conflict, I really do recommend that you go away and read Amy Gallo's book. If we think about conflict, we can break it up into 4 different categories. So there's the task, the what, the process, which is the how, someone is going about doing something, and then there is the relationship, and then lastly, status. And 9 times out of 10, when we are giving someone feedback, it's not actually relational. It's not about status, it's about the task or the process. So remembering that, depersonalizing the conversation helps us to move away from amygdala hijack. So I'd now like to share with you a model that I find really, really helpful. And this model is the SBI model. I'd love to know, actually, first of all, before we dive in here, how many people have heard of this model before? There are several models of feedback, one which has a rude name, so I won't mention it on this workshop, but I think we all know which one it is, that is typically used throughout corporate life. But let's just have a show of hands for how many people know the SBI model.
We've actually had a couple of people already say that they have heard of this model before, which is brilliant.
Okay, fantastic. And can we ask a second question there, Elspeth?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Can we ask how many people, it's wonderful if people have come across this before, how many people already use it when they're giving feedback? And very happy to hear any comments if people have got comments here, as well as the raised hands.
Yeah, definitely. So we've had a couple of raised hands. Someone has said that they try and adopt this when obviously giving feedback. We've had a couple more raised hands as well, which is great.
Perfect. Okay, lovely, fantastic. Well, let's do a little bit of an explanation as to what this is and why it is useful for those who haven't come across it before. So the SBI model is a tool which is taught by the Centre for Creative Leadership on their executive training programs, and it really helps us to become more adept at giving feedback, and it helps the person receiving the feedback to get information on the impact of their behaviour in a way that minimises defensiveness and encourages them to make appropriate changes. So when giving feedback, we need to focus on 3 areas to start with. So situation is the when and the where. So what we want to do here is we want to save the other person time and ensure they can visualize when this behavior occurs as quickly and as smoothly as possible. So please here, let's avoid vague terms. So many of us, it's sort of part of our vocabulary, isn't it? We talk about the other day, well, what other day? That's not helpful. Or, you know, in yesterday's client meeting, again, unless you only had one client meeting, we need to be a lot more specific here. And then we want to talk about the behavior. What did we observe? Now, if you Google the SBI model and you do some reading around it, as I did a few months back, some people recommend bringing others into this discussion. So instead of saying, you know, I noticed that, we notice that, I actually think that's very harmful, because it can make the person on the receiving end of the feedback feel as if you were having a conversation about them behind their back. And I actually think that's really detrimental to the outcome that you want this conversation to have. So describe the behavior, and please keep it to the behavior and the behavior only, because a lot of the time what we try to do, our brain likes it likes full circles, right? It wants to close the circuit. So naturally, our brain will try to figure out a reason as to why, logically for us, that behavior took place. But that almost certainly means that we're making subjective and a lot of the time biased assessments as to the other person's behavior. So then we have impact. And here there's a bit of a difference. Here we can talk about how the behavior impacted us alone, but also the team, without making it sound as if we've had a conversation that involved the rest of the team before bringing this feedback to someone's attention. And here, I think this speaks to, Elspeth, one of the points that a few people made right at the beginning of the workshop, that it is so important that we emphasize positive takeaways here. So certainly when I have had to do this as a manager, I've been very clear and direct, because I think we shouldn't fluff around what we're trying to say to the other person, but we want to say to them, I have 100% faith that you can reach the performance standards that I've set for you, right? Really sort of instill that sense of self and help that person hold on to their self-efficacy. And then the Centre for Creative Leadership actually recommends adding a further I for intent. So this is about discovering the reasons behind. And before we talk about this, I'd love to go to the group and ask people, what benefits might this second I have? Anyone like to share any thoughts here?
Well, I think we've got a couple of people typing at the moment, Laura, so we will let them finish typing. So someone has said empathy as important. Just got a couple of others typing away.
Keep your thoughts coming, everyone. It's wonderful to share like this.
Yeah, we've had misinterpretation for the task as well. Underlying issues might not be raised that needed attention. Taking out personal preference around communication and working styles.
That's excellent.
Yeah, really good. Okay, so interesting. Someone's put, they have always done it that way.
They've always done it that way. Can that person say more?
Well, they've kind of done it in inverted commas. So I assume the way that I'm reading it is that someone does something to say, well, this is how it's always worked, or this is the way that I've always done it. So nothing needs to change. At least that's, hopefully we're on the same wave, because that's how I've personally read it to my side. So hopefully the person who has typed that, yep, exactly what I was getting at. So glad we're on the same wavelength there.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm really going to pick up on a lot of the points that have been shared there. So the positive, the benefit of having that second I for intent really turns it into a conversation, and feedback should be a conversation. It's a process. It's absolutely not a one-way street. So it turns it into a conversation rather than the typical, I tell, you listen, and I still expect you to go away and make the changes that I'm pointing to without hearing really your perspective on it. So it will make it much more likely that the individual will open up about any challenges they're facing. It could unearth, as someone so rightly said, developmental needs. In a lot of organisations, I don't know if this will resonate with people, but I can talk about my own experience in HR. I worked at a number of corporations that just had annual appraisals, and I would sort of extract the training needs and try to plug those gaps on a yearly basis. But the reason that these conversations are so important is because, of course, things change much more frequently than an annual basis. And it really enables us to address our own false assumptions and reduce bias. So I'm going to put it together for you now. You'll see me glancing away slightly at the screen I've got in front of me to make sure that I don't miss any details. And we'll see how this could maybe be a much better approach than how we typically can give feedback. So Sarah, In the client meeting this morning, we started late because you were unable to load and share the slides properly, even though you promised last week to look into the IT issues that you've been having. And that really meant that as a team, we had to rush the presentation and indeed skip one or two really important points. And I noticed that you seemed really flustered throughout, which led to you not being able to answer two of the key client questions at the end, even though I absolutely know that you had it in you to answer brilliantly, because you'd mentioned the possibility of those questions coming up when we spoke about this a few days ago. I know that we've really had a lot on as a team recently, and I appreciate the long days that you've been doing, but you are usually so on the ball. So I just wondered, is there anything that you feel you need support on at the moment from me or the wider team to ensure that our next meeting runs a little bit more smoothly? So can you see how that's a better approach than the way that we typically give feedback? We make it very vague. We don't give that other person the opportunity for their input at the end. So here's something that's really important, and it's that people might get defensive and emotional, even if we use this structure, we've prepared well, and this defensiveness can really be caused by a range of factors. It can be, being used to given low quality feedback, not being given the chance in the past to speak up about things that are important to us, years of being told that you're not good enough, getting told maybe that you're doing well, but never with specific enough positive feedback that it actually leads to promotion opportunities for you. So the worst thing that we can do as leaders is to stop giving feedback, either to a certain individual or in general, because someone got defensive. And important here as well is that the model shouldn't just be used for developmental feedback. It absolutely needs to be used for positive feedback as well. A lot of the time, I know this is certainly true in law, we have the no news is good news approach, which is extremely damaging to individuals and workplace culture. I remember reading many appraisal forms, for example, whereby a partner would say of an associate, great work, keep on doing what you're doing, which just absolutely isn't helpful for someone's development. And it's also important that we remember people need to hear for their sense of self. They need that positive reinforcement. And research shows that the highest performing teams have a ratio of approximately 5-to-1 praise to criticism. So as managers, that's certainly something that we need to bear in mind. But the SBI model, as useful as it is, by itself isn't enough. So I'd like us now to look at 5 considerations for when it comes to giving high quality feedback. And some of this overlaps with what I was saying earlier, but just to restate these points because they're so important. The first is that we set and state our intention. So it's really important that we are clear on our why. So why are we giving the feedback, and also why now? Is it just because we think, oh, it's my job as a leader, it's what's expected of me, I don't know if this time particularly suits my team member, let's just get it out of the way. If we just feel the obligation to give feedback without focusing on the intention behind it, it's really likely that we're going to actually pass on unconstructive and sometimes damaging feedback. So secondly, to the extent possible, and this isn't always possible, so we have to sort of apply our judgment here, it's a really good idea to ask the other person how and when they prefer to receive feedback. And actually, I think a question that came through before this workshop, Elspeth, that I really liked, or a comment from someone was, I feel really awkward, uncomfortable when I receive praise. And I think this really speaks to the importance of understanding each of our team members. And for some people, especially if they're introverts, being praised in front of other people will be absolutely excruciating. So we need to treat others, and I love this quote. This is from the author of Radical Candor, Kim Scott, brilliant book for those who are interested in leadership. And it's, don't treat others how you want to be treated. It's about treating them as they want to be treated. And I think that is so important, because isn't it a phrase that we use all too freely? I want to treat other people as I want to be treated. Absolutely not. It's as they want to be treated. We need to safeguard against vague or biased feedback. So think about, for example, the difference between your email to the client could have been better, or the second sentence of your email restated the first, and so it could have been left out. That's really actionable for someone. Then we have to focus on substance and not style. So this again really speaks to how we manage diversity, how we manage difference. We need to focus on the content of someone's work, not what they were wearing, not the way in which they said it or expressed themselves. So really it's important to do all of this through a lens of cultural intelligence and sensitivity. And then lastly, linked to the above, and this speaks to a point that someone made earlier as well, which is brilliant. We need to link the feedback to what is strictly necessary for the role, and we need to make things task specific. So we don't want someone to walk away thinking, I am not good at this and I will always not be good. So that's why we have to differentiate between the task and the person. So really, we don't want to minimize anyone's sense of agency or give any sweeping statements. So I'm going to touch here on what we do if we've done all of this. We've got the SBI model. We've thought about these 5 considerations for high quality feedback, but things still go off course, which can sometimes happen. Now, conflict is, there's so much to say about this. There's enough for a separate webinar, but I want to share some tips that have come up in my research and that I personally have found really, really helpful. So the other person with whom we're sitting has reacted really, really badly to the developmental feedback we've given. What can we do? So we're now in a bit of a conflict situation. So their emotional reaction is quite intense. Ours is maybe as a result of that. So first of all, we can look at our language. So we should really focus on avoiding sentences which start with you, which is really easier said than done when we've got an angry person in front of us. But we don't want to say anything which could be misconstrued as an accusation, and I suppose can worsen that person's emotional reaction in the moment, because then there's a real risk that there'll be damage to the relationship. And the whole point of doing feedback well is we want the relationship to remain intact. So here we can focus on shifting the language from you to I. How is it impacting me? What am I noticing? So here we talk about our own perspective. Here's another one as well, which is that we shouldn't apologize for giving developmental feedback. This really shifts the focus away from the desired outcome, and it actually undermines our credibility as leaders, even though in the moment the other person might like to hear, I'm so sorry that I've had to raise this with you. I can see this is really uncomfortable for you. I feel awful. Later on, they'll reflect on it. And actually what you're speaking to there is your own neediness, right? Your own need to be forgiven for putting that person in an uncomfortable situation. So it can be really hard here to hold our ground, especially if we are natural conflict avoiders. But just because someone is having a really strong emotional response to our words doesn't mean that we should be sorry. So second point down here is focusing on saying and not but. So when we disagree with someone, it's easier to say, you do this, but it's better to do this. And we've got to remember that things aren't that binary. It's not necessary for someone to be wrong in order for us to be right. Thirdly, we can watch our body language and that of the other person. And this is really linked to emotional intelligence, which we'll come on to in a minute. We need to ensure that the words that are coming out of our mouths match our body language. So if we're saying something to someone, but on the other hand, our eyes are rolling, our arms are crossed, we've got a defensive posture, then actually that's not going to encourage the person to be calm. It's not going to de-escalate the situation at all. So what can we do if we really feel that we're coming under attack? And again, this is, I'm sure, sort of fairly unlikely here. But something that I read, and I think it's a really great tip. We've got someone in front of us who's now angry and they're shouting. We need to try to create as much space as we can between our body and their body. So sometimes we can almost imagine people's words as darts and they're hitting us directly in the chest, or they're landing just in front of us. And guess what? That further edges us towards amygdala hijack. Okay, so we're going to shut down, or we'll have a really angry response. So what this particular tip says is, if we focus instead on the darts as landing just over our shoulder, then it means that we can stay present. And I really, really like that. For those who are sort of visual, hopefully you'll find that useful. And lastly, we can take a break. If we feel that things have got to the point where they're not going to be productive, then actually we can say to our colleague, you know, I think that we've both got some thinking to do. Why don't we resume this conversation later today or first thing tomorrow morning? So before we move on now to responding to feedback, I just want to pause, because that's been rather a lot of information in 40 minutes, to see if anyone's got any comments or any questions at this point. And Elspeth, if you can do me the great favour of monitoring the chat again.
Definitely. I think it's worth noting that I know, Laura, you've mentioned a couple of books already, so we will be sending out an email afterwards, and we will pop in the books that Laura has mentioned and the authors, so that you guys are then able to obviously purchase those if required, or if you are interested in them. So yes, please do let us know if you have any questions so far. And it's quite interesting with some of the notes that have come through already, where someone's put, actually just before you mentioned one of the previous slides, Laura, is that someone mentioned about, oh, I've got to find it now, saying, I think it's often overlooked if staff or management that they are good at their jobs, then they don't need feedback, when actually you've already mentioned that if you are good at your role, you still need that feedback to understand, you know, so that that person is aware. So it's interesting that someone mentioned that before. You obviously brought that up in the webinar. And actually someone else has also said, I wish the leaders that really needed this training were here, as it's a brilliant insight. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so someone's just said, I think it's hard at the moment to do this when we work so remotely. Do you have any tips for that, as it always seems impersonal to me to do this on screen? And it's interesting because I actually had another question very similar to this as well, sort of being in that more hybrid or remote working environment, how you then sort of adapt, I guess, with having those conversations.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm going to give you an answer which I hope isn't going to sound like a non-answer, but I think it's really part of a bigger question, which is, if we know that the key to all of this is the relationship, and so the incidences of feedback are grounded in a bigger picture, which is the relationship, the question here really for individuals, and it's something that we can think about individually but also collectively as organizations, is how are we creating that psychological safety in the world of hybrid working? So, I mean, I would say, and forgive me, Elspeth, because I've just asked you to get people to sort of share comments, and it's such a great question. If anyone would like to know more about this, please do connect with me afterwards, because I've got a lot of thoughts on it, and I would be very happy to have a conversation. But I think it's about, how are we creating that psychological safety in everyday situations, for example, such as team catch-ups, meetings, in other scenarios, that then make it so that when we do have to give someone a piece of feedback, for example, over Zoom, instead of doing it in person, it doesn't seem like such a foreign or strange thing to do, if that makes sense. But what I am going to go to now, in the interest of time, because I have talked for far longer than I should have on that interesting first section, is to go on to responding to feedback. Okay, so research here shows that a decisive factor in the effectiveness of feedback is whether we see it as an opportunity to grow, or a fixed verdict on our ability, or what I was saying earlier, a fixed verdict on our person, on our very essence and identity. But feedback is vital in helping us understand blind spots and improving performance. So there's something really interesting here, which is a phenomenon widely known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which was named after the psychologists who authored it in a study in 1999. Explains how the more unskilled we actually are in a particular field, the more likely we are to overrate our ability in that area. So the worse we are, the better we tend to think we are. And so our incompetence makes it harder to understand how bad we are, hence the real need for someone to point us in the right direction. So people in general, we know, don't like giving feedback. We've established that. So if we want to go to our manager or someone in our team and ask for feedback, the worst question we can ask is, do you have any feedback for me? And this is again mentioned by the author of Radical Candor, Kim Scott, because it's very likely the person will say no. So what we need to do instead is ask, what can I do or stop doing to improve my performance in this area, whatever area it is? And what Kim Scott recommends in her book is that we really learn to listen when people are criticizing us, and we decide which bits are going to help us get better, and then we implement the changes. And I think that highlights something really important, which is that there will always be a degree of subjectivity in the feedback that someone gives us. That will come from childhood, that will come from a cultural perspective, personality styles. So it's really unlikely that 100% of the feedback that we're given will resonate and will be ready for us to implement in terms of changes. So we might only agree, for example, with 30% of it, but in order for us to decipher which 30% of it is going to be useful, we have to be open to listening to 100% of it. So this is where it's really, really important, and we'll come on to this in a second, that we know how to regulate our emotions. I've never seen The West Wing, but I read a brilliant article about this about a month or so ago now, that said that Bradley Whitford, who some of you might know, again, it's a bit lost on me, has a theory about responding to feedback. And he says that we typically move through 3 stages. The first is a "you suck," the anger response of "how dare you say this to me." That certainly resonates with me, because that always used to be my response to developmental feedback. And then after that, we move to a place, I suppose, of sadness or maybe shame of, actually, you know what, I suck. I'm not cut out for this role. I can't do this. And then with time, we move to the third stage, which is, okay, now what? So this is where's the learning, and let's make it better. So really our aim here is to be able to arrive at the third stage as quickly and smoothly as possible, with our sense of self still intact. So one of the ways that we can do that is by really understanding our physical and emotional reaction. So for example, and this is something that really resonates with me, because I used to have a strong shame reaction when I was given developmental feedback. So I get a tingly feeling, my palms would sweat, I would get red. So if we can recognize that that's what's happening and take a few breaths and just be really present in our body, it helps us stay present, right? And it helps us think, how can I move to that third stage of let's make this better? So this is probably one of my favorite sections of this whole workshop, and it is about emotional intelligence. So Daniel Goleman came up with the emotional and social intelligence model in the 1990s, and he talks about emotional intelligence really being the ability to observe and understand emotions in ourselves and in other people. So going back to that moment where we're in the middle of receiving some tricky feedback, and we're trying to stay present in order to digest the words of our feedback giver, in order to observe our emotional response, it's really important to be accurate about how we're feeling. And this comes to the concept that you'll see on your screens now of emotional granularity. So we're going to do an exercise now, just for about a minute or so. So we're Tuesday lunchtime today. What I would like you all to do is to get a pen and paper maybe, and I want you to write down the emotions you're aware of having experienced since the start of the week. So since yesterday morning, okay? So that is the first part of the exercise, and just try to be as nuanced as possible when you're writing down those emotions. I'll give you about a minute to do that. No need to share in the chat if you're not comfortable, but please do this exercise just for yourself. Okay, so since the start of the week, how many emotions are you aware of having experienced?
So someone's just said a sense of having a lot to do and need to be focused. I know personally that's something that I can relate to as well, and I'm sure most of us can relate to at some point, you know, even if it's just not this week, but previously as well.
That's very interesting, and I would urge that person, thank you for sharing. That to me speaks to sort of a need, you know, aware of having lots to do and needing to focus. And I would urge that person to think, okay, that's great. What's your emotional reaction to that? How do you feel as a result of being aware of those needs? And I'm going to move on now to ask you a second follow-up question. So you've got your list of emotions in front of you, and I'd like you to reflect on the actions that you took as a result of being aware of experiencing those emotions. I'll just give you about 20-30 seconds to think about what you did as a result of that realization.
So interesting. Someone has said frustration for things I cannot control and excitement for new things.
Does anyone have any comments on the actions that they took?
Wrote a list, someone has put. So someone has said that they take a break. So almost take a step back. Someone has said ask for help. Interesting. Okay, so someone has said nothing. What can I do if the other person doesn't respect me / my job?
So there's so much here that's really, really interesting. And again, this is a broad topic, so you can see that I've tried to squeeze in as many things as possible.
Definitely.
But
someone said took a break and make a cup of tea.
Which is actually a lot more powerful than it sounds, just having 5 minutes away to reflect on what you're feeling and what you might need.
Definitely.
And there's a great book that some of you might have read. I read it about a month or so ago called Atlas of the Heart by Brené Brown. And something that really, I suppose, stood out for me from this book was that Brené Brown surveyed 7,000 US citizens, I think it was. And she asked them for the number of emotions they were aware of experiencing. And the average number of emotions was 3. So it was joy, sadness, and anger. And when pushed to distinguish between sadness and anger, many couldn't. And the difficulty with that is that if we're not able to paint from as full an emotional palette as possible, it's really unlikely that we're going to be able to diagnose our emotions correctly. And if we don't diagnose them correctly, then it's really unlikely that they're going to signpost us towards what we need. And Susan David, who's written a brilliant book called Emotional Agility, says that emotions aren't directives, they're data, and they really are. I want everyone on this workshop to really think of emotional intelligence as another competence. It can be developed like every single other skill. And emotions are there to tell us what we need. And emotional agility is also really about accepting a full range of emotions without putting positive or negative labels on them. So much of the time, and I find it baffling how even wellness experts will deliver seminars on, you know, how to handle negative emotions. Well, actually, if we're giving an emotion the label of negative, it's extremely likely that it's going to lead to avoidant behaviors or unhelpful coping mechanisms. So I would ask people to really reflect on that. So I've shared that slide with you because emotions and how we react to feedback are so linked that if you can go away and do the work, reflect, you know, there's another resource, Elspeth, that I'll share with people afterwards, which is a wheel of emotions. And it just helps us to really realize how many emotions are available to us. And we've got to be really, really nuanced about them. So something that underpins all of this is relationships. we know that feedback in isolation is not helpful. And here, organizational behavior professor Abraham Kluger says that it's actually can be a really unhelpful intervention, because a lot of the time it makes performance worse. So he teamed up with Angelo Danesi in 1989 to study the effects of feedback on motivation and performance. And their findings really flew in the face of what most of us have believed about feedback for decades. So after reviewing hundreds and hundreds of feedback experiments, they found that in 38% of cases, feedback not only did not improve performance, it made it worse. And so he came to the conclusion that as a performance management tool, feedback in and of itself is actually very flawed and it's very risky. So what should we do about this then? Are we saying that we shouldn't give feedback at all? Absolutely not. Here it's about going back to feedback being a process and having those individual relationships with our team members. So we really want to move towards having a more of a coaching approach. And this speaks to that second I in the SBII model. We said it opens up a conversation on feedback and it makes it two-way traffic. So we want to have an approach which enables the people that work with us to increase their resourcefulness, reorganize their ideas, and course correct where necessary. And so really, how we respond to feedback is driven by the dyad, so the nature of the two people in the particular relationship. And I'll go back to Kim Scott again. The extent to which our behaviour will change and we will take feedback on board is dictated by the relationship with our manager. So it's really important that as managers, when we're giving someone feedback, we do two things. We care personally, we make it known that we care, and we challenge directly. So we don't put all of the fluff around a hard message. We give it in the best, clearest way that's going to lead to someone's career advancement. So do you remember at the beginning, I asked you about two approaches that feedback givers had taken with you? And I asked you to reflect on why one was successful and why one was unsuccessful. I'd now like you to think about the impact that both of those had on you. So everyone who shared, thank you so much for doing so. I would like you to share in the group now, just for the final minute or two, what impact did the successful approach have on you? And what impact did the unsuccessful approach have on you? And again, I'll just give you about 30 seconds now to share thoughts on either of those.
Right, I can see a couple of people are typing again. So someone has said it made me happy, feel like I'm growing as an individual, which I think is really important as well. Positive approach, motivated and valued. Negative experience, gave up, demotivated. So interesting. Successful, improved learning and better work products. I got a lot done quickly. The unsuccessful made me feel overwhelmed. Someone else says successful motivated me to be my best. Unsuccessful ruined my work relationships and made me want to find another position. So brilliant. So we've actually had quite a lot of feedback from people. So thank you so much for everyone who's been sharing that in the box. I know a couple of you have shared that with everyone. So I would suggest if you do have time, have a quick read through with what other people are saying as well.
Thank you so much. And just in the interest of time, I know that we've only a minute now. It's gone extremely quickly. I thought I would just share my own personal experience with this because I think it brings all of this to life quite well, which is that a few years ago, I asked my then manager for a pay rise. You know, I had my own personal excellence file, which contained positive feedback from stakeholders in the business. I'd done benchmarking like every good recruiter does. And so I had this phone call, and halfway through speaking, I was cut off, and she said, absolutely, it's more than justified. I'm going to speak to senior leadership and I'll get back to you. And I had to wait for about a month for that to happen, didn't hear anything, and 2 weeks later had a phone call with said manager, in which I was told that I would be getting a pay increase, and actually the pay increase was more than I had even imagined it would be. Little known to her, but that my performance, whilst good, didn't quite meet the standards in some areas, and this despite the fact that I had only received glowing feedback since my last performance appraisal. So all of this was completely new to me. And when I asked what was it specifically I could be doing better, I was told that I should basically just figure it out for myself. The good points, keep on doing more of that. And I think you should be doing more training. And the end of that was that even though some could say that I got what I wanted, because I got the pay increase that I'd asked for, the messaging surrounding it was so poor that I handed in my notice a week later. So why am I telling you this? It's because really feedback can have such a huge impact on how people feel at work, how engaged they are, their performance, and ultimately their turnover intentions. And we are living in a time where flight risk is very, very real. People now have more options than ever before. So I think as leaders, we've just got to be especially cognizant of the risk that poor feedback poses. And on the positive side, how much good feedback or a positive approach can really impact our colleagues' lives. So I'm aware that we've run over slightly. Thank you all so much for your time. I would love you to go away and reflect for yourself whether there is something specific that you're going to either start, stop, or study as a result of the hour that we spent together today. And please, even though we've got no time for questions now, I've shared my contact details. I'm at Altura Coaching. Please do reach out to me if anyone's got any further questions or comments that they would like to share, because I'm more than happy to engage in conversation around this. And thank you so much, CNC Search, for giving me this hour with you this afternoon.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I know personally, I've definitely sort of learned a lot from it as well. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out a follow-up email with Laura's details in there so that people can connect with you directly. And I appreciate we've not had a chance to answer all the questions that have come through, unfortunately. So yeah, please do reach out to us regarding additional questions. And again, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.